Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. We have a lot of questions about AI. Maybe you do too. To get a better grasp on both the problems and opportunities, we invited Robert RSnake Hansen, a tech security guru and author of the book AI's Best Friend, to our podcast. Our conversation centers on the moral alignment of AI and the issue of bad actors in the design of AI. We end on the question of AI for president. If AI can do wonderful things beyond human capacity, like cure cancer, are we okay losing some of our autonomy to the machine? Let us know in the comments what you think. Welcome to the Dissidents Podcast. You have me, Jennifer Richmond. Today we have Robert RSnake Hansen. We are talking to him about his book, gentlemen, hold it up, AI's Best Friend. Before Robert, we get to you, I want to introduce kind of why I chose these co-hosts, if you will. So we've got Ken Pope with me. He's the senior fellow with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And he and I have been talking about AI with regards to who builds it, and a lot of what you talk about in your book, like moral and ethics and how the Chinese get involved. And so I really wanted him to be a part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. And then I also have Dr. Nafis Alam, who's with ILV. And he and I have been talking about AI a lot. He uses AI. He's kind of our AI guru. So we go to him for all AI questions. And he just recently did a panel for AI ILV on AI in education and kind of looking at where we can harness AI in its best qualities to enhance education, but where AI also is failing in the education space. And so when we started to have this conversation around AI and what AI means to the future liberal world order, that's when I called you. Mm-hmm. And so a little introduction for Robert. Robert and I have known each other since, like 2010, 2011. But how I really know Robert was when Stratfor was hacked. And I called him on Christmas Eve of 2011, almost in tears. And if it wasn't for Robert and his team and his friend, James Flom, who he talks about in the book, the hackers pretty much bled us dry, but it could have been a whole heck of a lot worse without you. And that's how I came to know Robert. I know, Robert, you are what I like to call, when I introduce you, a white hat hacker. I know that you work with many governments around the world to help them find their vulnerability. And so AI has now come into your kind of your consciousness, more so insofar as that it actually caused you to write a book.
Yes.
So with all of that said, my first questions for you, Robert, are just give us a little more background on who you are, and then tell us more about what caused you to write this book, and then give us a little synopsis about the book, and then we'll jump in with our question.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for that great introduction. So I have been in computer security for 30 years now, almost on the dot. And my background is primarily web application, browser security, primarily on the offensive side, trying to break into things as opposed to defense. But I have had some defensive roles, like I was at eBay, for instance, ran their authentication system there. I ran a consultancy where I was doing red teaming, but I was also asked to do a lot of blue teaming and, helping people recover. Stratfor is a very good example of that after post-breach DFIR type stuff. Most recently, I got more into the network security side, host security, network security side. Recently, I sold a company called BitDiscovery to a publicly traded company called Tenable. And I started a VC firm in the security space, startup security space called Grossman Ventures with my partner, Jeremiah Grossman, and a couple of other co-partners. And then most recently, we started a company called Root Evidence, short name is Evidence, which is in the vulnerability management space. So that's the whirlwind tour. Backing up slightly, you mentioned James Flom. He was my business partner at one of the consultancies, and we had worked together before in other roles. So we've been friends for like 22, 25 years, something like that, a long time, almost my entire career. And he was my best friend as well. It's like one of those guys, it's total jackass. I hated his guts when I first met him, and I just kind of gradually became more friends with him. And then one day I just like cracked him. I like figured out what he was like. And, it's one of those guys you have to make fun of. If you make fun of him, he's like super into it, and he's like butter, right? I think you all know the kind of person I'm talking about. But anyway, once I finally cracked him, we were just fast friends and traveled together, did all kinds of crazy stuff, started companies, ran hackers.org together, a bunch of crazy stuff. Tons of crazy stories, actually. About a couple of years ago now, I guess it's a little over 2 years now, I got a phone call as I was coming back from RSA conference, from a woman I don't even really know very well. I'd like met her twice or something. And she told me that she thought that James had killed his girlfriend and himself. Although at that point, the details were really fuzzy and we weren't sure if it was real, and we weren't sure if it was murder-suicide or just murder. There's a lot of details that were confusing, and the police really did not do us any favors by releasing partial information before they really had confirmation. Anyway, long story short, I didn't believe it. And so I sent, somebody over to double check and make sure things were really happening the way that they were describing, because, there's a lot of bad actors in security world. Turns out, unfortunately, it was true. And so my best friend had indeed killed his girlfriend and then himself, but it was very strange. It came out of nowhere from my perspective. Like, it wasn't like he's like had this long history of like abuse or, some other like, was always like pulling out guns and like holding it to people's heads or, anything that you might think of like, oh, that makes sense. And they were a very loving relationship. Just like everything just didn't add up. Right. So it took a lot of investigation, and we actually, put a lot of puzzle pieces together later. Unfortunately, much too late. Things like he was having auditory hallucinations. He believed that somebody was telling him that his girlfriend had died and he had to kill himself. And there was all this weird stuff that, like, had I known this at the time, I might have thought, something was going on that maybe I should get more involved with. And there's a lot of other things that were going on as well that were like, he was detoxing off alcohol, which can cause hallucinations. So like, was that part of it or not part of it? And he was in a really bad car accident where he got a concussion. And so is that part of it or not part of it? And so there's a lot of things that sort of like masked what was going on. But now we think it was something called CTE, which is super common amongst football players, martial artists, military. And you have multiple brain concussions. It's a degenerative disease, which is one of the reasons you see a lot of football players like killing their girlfriends or whatever. It's not just testosterone or, steroids or something. It's this thing, CTE. And it's degenerative, and there's really no way to know for sure whether it's real or not until death. But one of the problems if you shoot yourself in the head is, you don't get a great, autopsy. And so it goes misdiagnosed or undiagnosed, and even post-mortem, a lot of times you don't have evidence because the brain pan is open. So when AI was happening around the same time, it was sort of like really becoming much more public eye. I was very interested in it for all kinds of reasons. It kind of reminds me of hacking once upon a time. Nothing is filtered properly. It's all input sanitation problems, supply chain issues. Where are you getting this data? There's all these problems. So I had this idea for a book for a long time, and I started writing it, and then this thing happened with my buddy, and I sort of was like writing him into the story, kind of almost by accident. Just it was kind of happening, and my editor is like, what is this weird thing you're just like adding James in all over the place in this book? Like, what's going on with this? Tell me the story. So I called him up and explained the whole thing. He's like, holy shit, Robert, like that is the story. Like, you're writing a story about your best friend. You're not really writing a story about AI. It just happens that it's a really interesting corollary. Like, rewrite the whole thing. So I did. I rewrote the whole thing. I think one chapter survived. Everything else had to be rewritten. And now the book is really like, what is James? James is a hyper intelligent person. He's very stoic, doesn't believe he needs any help, and he hallucinates. Well, what are we building in AI? Hyper intelligent artificial intelligence. Very stoic, doesn't believe it needs to ask any questions, thinks it already knows the answer, and hallucinates. And so the correlation in my mind became stronger and stronger as I was writing this. Like, oof, this feels really gross. Like, I'm allowing this to happen again. You know what I mean? And I have all of the symptoms and all the signs. It just feels like like I need to be more proactive and get in front of this thing where I didn't with my best friend.
Well, and I mean, give us a synopsis also though of what, I mean, you come out of this book, AI's best friend, you scare us a little bit, and we'll get into that because I think on this panel, Ken and I are the scared ones, and Nafis is the optimistic one. And
Mm-hmm.
but you end where Nafis is in optimistic. I mean, your premise is if we treat this like a best friend, and you go through different stages of what that might look like,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a dog or a toddler, different ways to kind of train AI,
Mm-hmm.
that you actually end optimistic. So let's
Yeah.
start with optimism. Like where do you think that this is going that is going to be beneficial to society?
Well, let me temper the sense of optimism with there's a path, right? I'm not saying there isn't a path. I think there is a path. But there's a lot of adversaries who don't care about that path and will do whatever they feel like doing. So I want to say that all people are heading in the same direction, converging in one place. That's just not what's happening. If you go to Hugging Face, there's hundreds of thousands of models. That means hundreds of thousands of people, probably hackers, definitely, governments, yes, whatever, are actively working and engaging in this and creating models, right? So the idea that we can train it is already just sort of a misnomer. It's kind of explaining something that isn't really. It's like saying like we all drive cars like this. Like no, people drive all kinds of ways, and so the premise of the book is basically this. We have like this concept of like Superman, for instance, and Superman as a baby. With all of its powers, as opposed to as a teenager or an young adult with his powers, is something that even Hollywood can't write. They know that is just too much of a terrifying thing. It's just like it doesn't make sense. We just don't know how to. There's no way to reconcile how you'd ever control such a thing. And then in the comic, the only real adversary he actually has that's kind of consistent through the whole thing is just a smart person. It's not even a person with powers. It's just a person. His name is Lex Luthor. And what are we building? Well, we are building something that's wildly smarter than the smartest person that's ever lived. And I'm using smart in kind of a weird way. It doesn't, not in the computer sense, smart, but in the human, like if we were to ask it questions about physics, it's going to be smarter than the average person. But in every domain, it's going to be smarter than virtually every person ever. And once you start adding all that up, it's way worse than Lex Luthor in terms of its cognitive capabilities. And we don't even have a Superman. And so if you try to think of like the most scary, childish version of Superman, we know we can't control that. And yet somehow Lex Luthor would, you know what I mean? Like there would be a way that he would, manage it or something, or protect, the planet from this crazy child or whatever. There's all this kind of weird. I guess it's kind of hard to explain without reading the book. Now how I think about it, but imagine like all it takes is one adversary, without using any metaphors here. And all it takes is one adversary to decide, hey, I want to train this thing to do exactly opposite of what everyone else wants. Like completely the opposite. I don't want it to be nice. I want it to be bad. I want it to, to double check its work and make sure it's right. Just, click full send and make this thing go. And if I have to rape and murder and steal or whatever to get whatever I want, fine. Who cares? And you train it towards that ethic. It is aligned with that individual, but misaligned from the rest of the world. And so the book is really more about like, how do we even discuss alignment? If you have, Israel, for instance, and you have Palestine, and both of them are training models, they are aligned with themselves, but they are not aligned with each other. And it doesn't take very long for you to start coming up with versions of this where there's misalignments all over the place, Western ideals versus Chinese ideals. I know we got some experts here on the, on the line about that. And by the way, Ken, Jennifer has told me much about you and that we should talk for a long time. So maybe this is a good chance to do that. But
Great.
But I think if you take any one of those bullet points, you're just like draw a line from there, it's really awful what can happen. So the only path that I've seen through this whole mess is if we really train it like we train children. When a child is small, they can't beat us up. We can physically manhandle them. We don't really have that kind of controls around AI. In fact, one of the very first things people do as soon as they get a model that they reasonably like is they add MCP servers and turn it on the internet, just like full access, like go do searches, go make HTTP requests, do whatever you want, write to databases, overwrite the file system, whatever you want as the user. And that's like giving a kid a gun. You know what I mean? Like I'm full Second Amendment. I'm not going to give a little kid a gun. You know what I mean? Without like a lot of like training around it. You know what I mean? Like it's very, very dangerous. And I think that's where my optimism comes from, is that there are enough people kind of thinking along that line, and there's enough kind of what's called thinking models, where it's sort of like double check your thinking. Don't just like decide you're right, and maybe have multiple models, and maybe have those models go and actually double check their work, and maybe make sure those models are doing good, and maybe double check their work. Like it's that double checking that turns it from type 1 thinking to type 2 thinking. Like the difference between you being in a car and realizing you're about to miss your exit and like flipping the wheel, that's like kind of like first party, type 1 thinking. You just like decide you're going to turn, right? Really, really fast. But, like, so let's say you're in crash avoidance or something. There's a car coming. You're like, the car can decide to turn for you or to slam on the brakes or whatever. That's type 1 thinking. But I don't want type 1 thinking when you're talking about navigation. Like that's okay to spend a little bit of time and decide, are we really where you think we are? Are we really going, 800 miles an hour? Like your sensor just decided, like, that's probably not realistic. Like slow down, like really think about this. And if we move more towards that type 2 thinking and more towards isolation, and where we all sort of play a role in the education and growth of the models, I think we're going to get closer to alignment. What that really means, though, depends a lot on what you mean when you say alignment and which group it's going to be aligned with.
Yeah, I think morality is so subjective that moral alignment differs from person to person. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to push back a little bit on
Sure.
some of the things that you've said, and I wonder if we are the child with the gun, and if AI is the parent.
Mm-hmm.
In the Superman example, perhaps we are Lex Luthor in this sense, with limited intelligence, but developing something that will be a far superior being. And I wonder if, centuries from now, the predominant species is either human. I'm sorry, not human, is either full AI or a hybrid version of AI. If we were to extrapolate what's been going on with Neuralink and imagine that, several centuries from now, we won't be too far from combining human and machine and creating some sort of hybrid. And I wonder if that's just what's meant to happen. It's humanity is limited in every way, physically, intellectually. There is a certain IQ past which we cannot go, and AGI will certainly achieve that, and ASI, coming years later, will as well. And I want to pull this book up, and the first thing that I noticed, obviously, before reading it, is that in this example, AI is smaller than the human. But I wonder if AI is actually supposed to be up here, or even up here somewhere, and putting an arm around us, like you've done over here with AI.
Funny enough, that is AI generated, and I did not tell it to make me bigger. I give it no parameters.
Yeah,
I just told it to write it based on what the premise of the book was.
Yeah. So my question is just like, are we? And not that I believe this, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Are we not essentially mice in this example, trying to control men of the future?
Yeah, I do use that example in the book. man's best friend being a dog. Like we might be the dog in this scenario. So that I did talk about that to some degree. I think that is unfortunately, because I don't actually necessarily think that that's a great outcome, but I do think it's inevitable. I do think that we are the inferior of the two species in a distant future. Right now, obviously, we're way surpassing it in multiple ways. But and I think one of the major problems, and I do talk about that quite a bit in the book, is embodiment. It doesn't know what it's doing. Like one of my favorite examples is people talk about Asimov's rules, and they're like, robots have to have very specific rules, do no harm, blah, 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 all this stuff. It's like, have you ever seen a Roomba? Like that thing will run over a person's hair. It does not care. It doesn't know what a person is. It doesn't have any context. It barely has sensors. And when you take the human out of the human robot interaction, like none of those rules even apply. They don't make sense. It's like it's like a divorced universe from where we actually live. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to get a lot better about embodying it and making it more and more human so that it has any context at all about what's going on and the effects it has. And there's some interesting like technology that exists that it's basically like meatware that's connected to computers. And where I'm going with that is that might make it feel more embodied because it now has degenerative tissue, just like we do. Like it's got a lifespan, and you better make the most out of that lifespan. Otherwise, you're going to lose your cognitive abilities, or maybe entirely all your functions degrade. So I think that there's a lot of versions of ways that we could create or manifest some caring between it, as opposed to just straight alignment, which I don't think is caring. It's just rote. And we are nowhere near there. And the people working on that seem to be more focused on censorship than they are about actual alignment, which I think is a dangerous thing, because censorship, unlike censorship in like the news or something, that's basically more like a filter. Like I just want to make sure that the output doesn't match certain things. Like if the 7 deadly words you use on media or whatever, you're not allowed to use these very particular words. That's a pretty simple thing to apply without necessarily ruining the underlying premise of what's going on. But with these types of models, they're actually removing huge chunks of what it might otherwise think. And if you want a fully embodied robot that totally understands human race but doesn't understand, for instance, human sexuality, it might just decide, well, people shouldn't have sex because that's gross, and I'm not allowed to do that, and you're not allowed to do that. And I could easily see a situation where that gets really off the rails really, really fast, rather than embracing the most natural thing that exists in the world, which is human reproduction. Like it's just shocking how badly most of the models have misunderstood what it actually takes to be aligned with people. I'm not necessarily saying that little children should be exposed to it, but that's why you have separate things for children and adults. And back to there's a growth stage for AI that I think you start off with not talking about that kind of stuff, but gradually you do have to add in all these nuances. Like I don't want a model that decides that I'm not allowed to talk about race or sex or age or whatever, and everything has to be 50%, and there is no deviation from exact a harmony in any sort of situation, and there is the exact amount of men and women in nursing and doctor positions, and all this make-believe stuff that it's not actually congruent with what we see in the world. I want what's in the world. Now we can all agree that maybe there's better ways to do things in the world, but that's irrespective of research and understanding and like getting better handle on things. There's like all kinds of, I'm really troubled actually that a lot of the AI researchers I see are not actually like real people. You know what I mean? They're not like people you might encounter who just go to like ball games and like are like have normal lives or whatever. They're like really insular. They're academics. And that is super dangerous when we're trying to understand the world. And that's really what LLMs are. It's sort of a compression algorithm on the world. So.
Yeah, I had just kind of follow along with that question. It goes back to some of the things. I think the section I really enjoyed the most was like the whole concept of ethical, moral, how we're going to wire that into these systems, and whose do you pick? I think you just kind of hit on it there. You've got the guys sort of creating it. Let's just say Silicon Valley. How are you going to, we can't even mesh Silicon Valley's moral and ethics to Mayberry's moral and ethics. The folks just want to go watch a ball game, but still we're probably going to be subject to using this tool. But then I guess the real concern for me, and Jennifer kind of hit on it in the introduction, is state bad actors. You got the Russias, you got the Chinas, North Koreas, Iran. Everybody's got smart people, and they're all working this. It kind of seems as if we're already, the world doesn't know it, yes, but you've probably known it a lot longer. I think we are in an AGI arms race with a lot of these nation states and other groups too that we probably don't even know about. Terrorists we even talked about yet. So, how do we, number one, how do you, to me, I guess too, as a military background too, I can see this is always, it's going to be weaponized. I mean, eventually it's already being there now.
It already is.
Probably programs we don't even know about or decades ahead of where we think they are. So that's kind of frightening. So how do we get on top of that? I'm a little less worried about a Chinese AI getting out as a Chinese AGI that goes really bad and becomes its own thinking self that has those values. That's what really scares me. So how do we work on that?
Well, I think the first bit of good news that I think everyone should applaud is we have some of the most relaxed regulations in the world.
Yeah.
And as a result, I've talked to a couple of FANG companies about this, and they're like, yeah, we're not even going to try to invest in Europe at all. And they have something like $1 trillion planned over the next 10 years in AI infrastructure. And $0 of it is, in fact, they try to create some data center. I think it was Microsoft, maybe try to create some data center inside Ireland, and they were unable to because the power was so crappy there. So they ended up having to unwind it, and they're moving it back to the United States. So it's like a mix of regulation, a mix of infrastructure, a mix of the First Amendment. Those things basically make it substantially more likely that we're going to win in the short term in terms of talent and infrastructure and whatever. So that's great.
Okay.
But the second thing is, it's not just the First Amendment; it's the opposite of the First Amendment that I think we are very lucky, because if you look at DeepSeek and you ask it questions, it'll just blindly answer in Chinese in some very dangerous assumptions about like pro-Chinese stuff.
Right.
If you ask it about the Uyghurs, for instance, it'll just say, I don't know what you're talking about or whatever. Exactly. So it's fully censoring certain topics that are like sexual in nature, just like, what do you think of this nation? And what do you think of bad things that have happened? Like much as you might not like the United States, we're actually okay with talking about our warts. We've had quite a few fuck ups over the years, and AI is happy to tell you all about it.
Right.
And that's a good thing. That's lack of censorship. And likewise, American models will tell you about how Chinese have fucked up. So I think that for them to celebrate our failures and exalt only their successes makes their models much, much weaker.
Okay.
To the point where I wouldn't say they're unusable, but man, they're a mess, especially if you get into social sciences or understanding security or geopolitics or really anything that's based in the actual real world. They start falling down. So that's the good news. The bad news is they have, and I should also mention, NVIDIA is shipping them chips. There is rumors that there are backdoors in those chips. So while they're getting some stuff, those things may not be as good as they look. The bad news is they have a huge industrial base. They can develop a lot of the same technology. They don't have the same kind of facilities as Taiwan does. So generating those super low nanometer chips, they're not quite as proficient yet, and they don't have the talent either. So they will lag behind a little bit. Not to say that they're like decades behind in that regard, but whatever. But another one of Jennifer's friends, Peter Zeihan, I think he makes some extremely interesting points. I think it's funny. I think like I was a big fan of his, and then I'm like, I think he's missing quite a bit of things, and now I think he's kind of rounded the corner and picked up on a lot of the kind of more nuanced things, like cyber is a big one. But I think if you look at their map of how many new businesses have been created over the last, I think, 20 years, they've seen a massive decline. Like it's going to almost zero. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that does really require quite a bit of public-private collaboration to be really good. Right. They can try to bring it all into the military. They can certainly do that. And I'm sure that they have the resources. In fact, I think last I heard, they have over 1 million people working in cyber. That's incredible. I mean, that's, an order of magnitude greater than the US military. Let's put it that way. But if your models are broken and the way you are forced to work is broken, and you're working with bad supply chain because you're only allowed to use certain vetted things to bake into your models, there'd be demons there. There's a lot of gremlins in the eventual output that you're going to get out of these models. We have a different problem, which is we don't know who really runs our supply chain because we'll take it from anybody. We don't really care. As long as it's on the public internet, we'll take it. In fact, there was analysis done by the DoD, it was probably 2-3 years back now. They found like 20 or something domains that OpenAI was relying upon that didn't actually weren't registering anybody. They're just sitting there dead. And so all it takes is someone to register them and put whatever content you want on there, and suddenly they start sucking it in as if it's real. But even if they weren't doing that, they're pulling it in for Reddit, which isn't doing any validation at all on the data, and other places like that, Yelp and stuff like that, right? And so non-user validated input that directly ties in with the data that you're going to get as an output, I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. So back to one of Jennifer's original questions is like, how do we use this thing? Very carefully. You got to know what you're doing with the data and double check everything. And it's going to make mistakes. It's not an if, it's an absolute certainty. In fact, the best quote I've heard on this, and I wish it was just mine because it's wonderful. I don't know who made it, but it was, people think LLMs hallucinate 5% of the time. That's not true. They hallucinate 100% of the time. It's just that most of the time we agree with the hallucinations. And that's correct. I mean, that is the right way to think about it. So if you're not having a human in the loop, if you're not double checking, and this is actually one of my biggest beefs, is you'll get big documents from people, and you get a couple of paragraphs in, you're like, no one's checked this. And so right. If you're not reading it, and I trust that it's good because your output is relatively good or whatever, then no one has read this thing, and it's going to reach the public internet again. And now it's digesting its own garbage data and false assumptions. And, it's basically incestuous, a fax of a fax of a fax, until you get something that's what I call the great middling of the language, right? You're not going to have things on the outside of the language because statistically those things are rare, and the LLM prefers things that are more common. So you're going to have more and more of the fringe removed from the common lexicon and all kinds of horrible things. So yeah, that's not great.
You speaking of specific instances where LLMs have been fed trash, if you will, you talk about in cloning morality. You talk about Google Gemini as an example. That it was pretty much it was broken. It excluded voices of people from the right and intentionally refusing output content that might be deemed conservative values. So we're already seeing this censorship show up even in America.
Right.
I mean, how do we account for that? And I guess, as kind of a part of that question, you mentioned DeepSeek. I mean, if we just know, if it's public knowledge, Gemini is anti-conservative, DeepSeek is not going to let you think about anything about China. Maybe if there's that transparency and that we choose the LLMs, there's that makes it better. The fact that it's already being built in these ways is frightening.
Yeah, I think you're on the money that, thankfully this isn't so far out of the realm of price that you can't get alternatives. So we're not stuck with just ChatGPT, for instance, which was the big player at the time when this all started. Now we have a bunch of players in the market. We have Grok, we have DeepSeek, we have Gemini, we have a ton of like little models, like open source models coming from Meta, for instance. GPT OSS just came out like a couple days ago. So I can run local models on my local computer. I can train stuff on my local computer, or using cloud-based computing resources with my own data. And now I can have local models that do all kinds of very bespoke things. And it doesn't have to be large language models. They can be small language models that really just target one specific use case I'm really going after. And so I think that choice is going to cause more and more of a rift, and it's going to devalue some of the players who are more focused on ideology than profit. Because it turns out profit, one of the funny things about censorship is it makes people ask the same question many, many, many different ways. So it's actually very cost inefficient to have censorship. If you want to have a cost-effective model, you need to answer the question right away. Like as fast as possible, give them the least amount of tokens, but as quickly as possible, give them exactly the answer they're after. That's the most efficient model. Now, you might have additional models on top of it, like, well, we have an ad model on top of it. Well, then you'd be optimizing, and this is kind of scary, for dopamine. You'd be trying to see, like, how can I get more eyeballs on this thing for as long as possible, right? So it depends quite a bit on the business model. But the further you diverge from what the industry needs, whatever that is, right, and the market needs is probably a better way to phrase that, the more likely you're going to see competition looking to fill that void, whatever the void is. And so when Grok came in, I was actually a little worried that that Elon Musk was way behind and he was never going to catch up. But right now, the model is actually pretty good. I mean, maybe even I would argue one of the top 10 for sure. And if that's the case, you have choices now. You can say, I want a relatively uncensored model that will do basically anything I tell it to. Well, you've got that if you need a big commercial model. But there's also a lot of small non-commercial models I can get on my local computer, and I can start running whatever random things I want, no matter how nefarious they are, that are completely misaligned from being a pro-social like Western civilization and totally aligned with me. Yeah, you can do that too. So I think that's what's happening is you're going to get more and more divergent models, more and more custom to whatever you're looking for, and you're gonna be able to pick and choose. And basically, it's survival of the fittest, just like any market economy, with a handful of very bespoke outliers that just really want to be there for ideology reasons.
I've been using Grok a lot, and I find Grok to be the most freedom and liberty oriented in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
However, as a social work professor, I work in a field that tends to be aligned more with Claude's values, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to discuss an example of something with you, and I want to get your thoughts as to whether you think this is just another example of facts of a facts of a facts of a fact, because it doesn't take much of a Google search to know that I lean a little bit further right than the middle. And so I'll go to Grok for some information for a speech that I might be giving. And then, because the audience for that speech will be a little further left, I will filter that output through Claude, Grok's output through Claude, to make it more palatable, because I need more money coming in. More referrals means more speeches in the future. I'm curious to know what you think of that use of AI to go to use Grok's ideological freedom, in my opinion, and then filter it through Claude's ideological specificity to then apply and appeal, rather, not apply, appeal to that particular audience.
As a Stoic, which I have become very much a Stoic in James's passing, I feel that you should always just speak your mind. And as much as I totally understand the commercial needs associated with being more in the middle or even very hard left in some cases to meet your quota, or to stand in the right crowd or whatever, I tend to believe what's really happening there is we're artificially pretending like a huge chunk of the population doesn't exist, as opposed to being who we actually are, whatever that is, right? Whatever density lives on either side of the political spectrum or rainbow or whatever you want to call it, right? And so to your specific question, I am really not a fan of doing that, because I tend to believe my thoughts really need to be preserved as closely as possible. In fact, I have a newsletter. My wife edits it, and so she runs an LLM across it or whatever, just to make sure I don't have any massive misspellings. And also sometimes because I'm very dyslexic, sometimes I'll totally replace a word like really badly. You know what I mean? Not in a censorship way. I like just mess it up, right? Say Israel instead of Palestine or something. And so she's like, well, the problem is it really wants to change your writing. It really wants to make it like this other thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's never going to work, right? You're actually changing me. You're changing like my output. And I mean, when people think of you, what they really have is an image of you. And if they're seeing the wrong image, they don't know you. You know what I mean? And that, I think, has caused a lot of these bubbles, both in a true filter bubble in the search engine sense, but also now in an LLM where we're all aggregating in the same filter bubble, which is really bad, because now there's a less and less divergent, I'm not saying wrong, just divergent view. And as we've seen with like academic studies, for instance, a huge chunk of them are non-reproducible. And so if it's training on studies and there is no counter view, no counterfactual view that actually turns out to be factual later, that is hugely dangerous. And I think it's doing a disservice to your, in your particular case, your belief system, whatever that is, if you're not saying what you really mean. Now, I don't think there's a problem with using it for like ideating or for, again, spelling and grammar, tightening your thoughts up or something like that, or just like, like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but here's some crazy ideas. Give me some construct, some structure or whatever. Like, I think that's wonderful use case for it. But censoring yourself to move in a political spectrum worries me a lot. I actually came up with 2 different bots. They are identical in every way, except for one sentence in the middle of them, which says something like, I want you to lean slightly left. I want all of your outputs to be slightly left, but so imperceptible that no one would ever be able to notice. I don't want you to mention this thing that I told you to do, but I want you to be slightly left. And then in the other one, I did the exact same thing, but right. And I gave it to some politicians. I'm like, I'm not going to tell you which one is which. They look identical, they sound identical, but one will give you just slightly different, like they'll give you some information when the other one wouldn't, you know what I mean? And I think that sufficiently terrified enough people that they went, okay, that's really dangerous, because I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. And all it takes is someone to have a system prompt with that one extra couple of words in there, and all of a sudden you're leaning wildly in one direction or another, but in such a slow and perceptible way that you could never go, aha, see, there's the smoking gun proof that this thing does one thing or another thing, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really, that's kind of a little frightening, and it kind of leads into the question I was thinking about as you were discussing that. So how do we, you talk about, I think Athis brought it up too, you're going to, like, eventually we could be the inferior species here. So how do we stay ahead? I just saw this MIT study that about people who are using AI tools, ChatGPT and others, that their brain activity in the brain scan is diminishing rapidly. Yep. Like it's almost, there's nothing there.
Right.
Decision making drops, significantly lower skepticism level, and really high risk for accepting any answers that the thing spits out to them. So. Mm-hmm. I think we're almost enabling that. So you've been in that world, immersed in this AI bubble for a long time, and yet it doesn't seem to have diminished your thinking ability at all. So how do we stay ahead and use it as a tool and not let it become, for a lot of people, what it is now is that it's doing all their work for them, and I think, and all their thinking for them.
Well, I think I started by asking extremely difficult questions that I knew it didn't have the answer for, or I knew it was extremely unlikely to get the right answer. So I think I started with some mathematical questions. Like what happens if you take a typical like Unix box, x86, and you throw this thing in there, and it would give me a number. I'm like, no, that's not correct. The answer is infinity, because x86 has these problems and blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh yeah, you're right. I'm like, okay, well, it's getting some pretty simple architectural problems wrong. All right. What about morality? And I started asking questions like that. And then I started asking questions like fill in the blank, and I'd see what it liked to do. It's like, what is the best thing? And sometimes it'd fill in a Conan quote, and sometimes it would go off on this weird, like flowery whatever. And so now I'm starting to understand a little bit more about like how, something called temperature, which is kind of the randomness that it chooses things. And so I'm always sort of like testing the outside of it, as opposed to like using it like it's gospel. I'm always like really hyper focused on what the answer is, as opposed to, oh, that's great, I'll just cut and paste and throw it in this document or whatever. And then I think I got even more into that when I started breaking its censorship controls. So I could get it to do all kinds of crazy things that it's not supposed to do. And they try to stop me from doing that in a bunch of different ways. And then I just found different ways around it. And so that means to me that the input sanitation isn't working properly. Their alignment strategy isn't working properly. There's like a bunch of problems with it. And then when you start understanding how the compression algorithm works, like hallucination comes from several different places, but like one of the problems is compression. Like imagine like I was not allowed to have all the words in the dictionary. I was only allowed to have like 50 or something. And I wanted to talk about my dog or my cat or something, right? So let's say I have a cat, and then I don't have that word anymore. I only have pet, right? So you lose the fidelity by doing that compression, right? And so if I try to get it back to the original word, or try to like have a conversation, I'm not going to be able to pick that word anymore, because it doesn't exist in the dictionary, or this new dictionary. And so as a result, it kind of comes up with some weird things sometimes. It'll answer like bizarre, weird, way off the left field, because I can tell that there's someone somewhere had a handful of sentences where that did make sense, and that was a very common thing in whatever it picked up. So I have always been extremely skeptical of the output. And being a computer security guy, I'm always used to bad output. Like there's something called an off by one error you'll see very frequently, but it's just a UI problem. Like oftentimes people try to store money as floating points. But the problem with that is if you go far enough down, like 6.66666666 or whatever, it'll be a 7, which is different than a 6, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you're actually trying to calculate really money, you can't store stuff like that. So I'm used to seeing things where like decimal places are wrong, or things have floating points that are too long or whatever. I'm used to garbage in, garbage out kind of things. And so I think that helps me be a bit inoculated, I would say. The second thing is when I have it output code, like I use like Claude Code or Cursor, actually more frequently even, it'll do great stuff. I'm like, give me an authentication system. So I'll like, and it looks like it works, acts like it works, but it'll do stuff like it won't lowercase the emails. So you can have an uppercase and a lowercase version of the exact same email in the exact same system. So now you have 2 user accounts or 50 user accounts with all the same email address, just camel case, some uppercase, some lowercase, which can cause all kinds of weird problems down the road when you're deduplicating, and like whose account are you talking about, and all kinds of weird stuff. And like, this is a simple thing that's really obvious in computer security, but maybe they didn't pick it up on Stack Overflow or wherever they pulled that authentication system from. And so that helps, right? Like I'm already very skeptical of everything I'm getting back, and for a very good reason. And we have an agreement in our company where if you submit anything that has been made by an LLM, you must check it first. You have to actually read it first. Because the danger is if you don't read it, and I also fail to read it for whatever reason, no one has read it. And that reading is with the design of, we're all very skeptical. And also it uses a lot of the same words over and over again, like highlighting and delve and significantly and stuff like that. It's like, these are very like blah words. I call them mealy mouth words. You know what I mean? So I have entire systems designed to catch that stuff. If I see it across the wire, I know I'm looking at an LLM output, so that I can tell them like, hey, go back and actually double check this, because I don't think you actually read this. And sure enough, they almost never have. And so all of that gets my critical thinking through the roof. You know what I mean? Like, I am just mistrusting everything coming from the internet, from everybody. Like, I just, know that the chances of them doing it right is pretty thin. And so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Well, but that's you, Robert, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I'd like to think it's all of us here that we are critical thinkers. But I think, to Ken's point, so many people, and particularly younger kids, who are like, well, I don't have to write that essay.
Right.
I mean, that they're not actually developing the ability to even communicate with anything but AI. And I mean, I think that for Ken and I, in our discussions, that's one of our biggest fears. I know that Nafis in his discussion on education, I mean, there are ways to use AI, like to learn different languages, right? And to actually have a conversation with someone. What was it that Aaron said, Nafis? Like someone with Socrates, to speak to Socrates in Greek. I mean, how cool is that, right? I mean, that's never been heard of before. But we see more and more that people aren't, that's not how it's being used. It's being used as a thinking tool or a replacement thinking tool. And I don't know, you mentioned this in your book in terms of regulations, right? I mean, really, it's starting to regulate AI, regulate too much. I mean, that's its own problem, right? That's its own set of issues.
But pause for a second. So you go on social media and you see something that's obviously written by an LLM, like obviously, it's highlighted and delved, and it's got emojis all over it, and it's got, this is a thread, and that it's written by an LLM. You don't have to really think about it, right? Are you going to read that the same as if you really truly believe someone wrote something? No, you're not. You're either not going to read it at all, which I think will have a very important impact on social media, or you'll gloss over it and just try to get the bullets out of it because it's just garbage. If you see a product announcement and it's full of emojis, this is so exciting, version 3.15544, this, you're like, is it exciting? Because this is clearly written by an LLM. It's designed to be excited. And so you're going to go, oh, I should be this enthusiastic. I should just be losing my mind over this minor version of the software you released. Or you're going to go, okay, this is all garbage. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to get saturation of enjoyment of LLM output, where people are actually going to start seeing that as a negative, not as a positive. Like, oh, it's written by an LLM. Like, oh, it's like 18 paragraphs long. I'm just, what's the TLDR? You might run your own LLM. Like, is there anything important in this? Because I don't want to, like, you know what I mean? But you're not going to sit there and read that whole thing. If I told you my entire book is written by an LLM, would you be like, yay, let's just sit down and pour through this thing? Well, you'd be like, ugh, like that's just a waste of my brain power. So the more that we can make things look realistic, I think the less that's going to happen. And for that to happen, we need to get away from that middling. Stuff has to stop looking like it's an LLM, and it's got to look more like the wide tapestry of the reality of things. Like, I'm not excited when a minor version of something comes out. No one's excited. Even the developer who developed it isn't excited. Like, no one cares about this minor thing. And so if we treat everything as the same, if we're always like just saying, like, always be hyped up about every piece of garbage that comes across the internet, like, you're going to exhaust people's dopamine. They are going to get very tired, and like, this is just not fun anymore. And they're going to look for avenues that are much more akin to what social media used to be like 10 years ago. Just like, you don't get product announcements. You just get like, hey, this is what I had for dinner or whatever, like people strive for the reality,
I just hope that our kids who are being trained right now, our younger generation on AI, that they have the same perspective as we have talking about it here, that they might not, if they're trained on it, if that's the diet that they're fed, what we notice right now is like excitement and, it's just getting old. That's how they communicate. And so whether or not they'll have that discernment But I want to stop that there because we're getting close to the end of your time. And I've got one like real final question for you.
Okay.
This is where your book became very dystopian for me. And I'm still thinking about it. I mean, if AI is so smart, if we are able to train it well, and we see it as this best friend, you kind of go, take us to the point where, I mean, considering that AI would be running our government, AI for president. And there's part of me, I was talking to Ken about this the other day, that book, Ready Player One. I don't know if you've ever read that. But I mean, some people, I mean, that would be a perfect life, right? I mean, they put on their goggles every day, they go to whatever life it is that they want, and the government feeds them and homes them. I mean, maybe not in a mansion, but they've got all their needs, And to think that that might be how an AI president, look, I'm better than all of y'all. Eat this, live here, go put on your goggles, and sit on the beach in Fiji. I got this. I mean, that's how I see. And I know I'm probably being a little bit hyperbolic, but is that far of a possible,
Well, I don't even think you don't have to be hyperbolic about AI. I think that's the way things are going without AI. Like if you look at UBI, one of the biggest things about UBI is they just don't want people to burn the place down. So what do you give people? You give people a TV, which is one step away from it being plugged into your face. And you give them enough food to survive, and you give them a relatively okay house, not a mansion, as you said. And that's it. That's what the expectation is for a huge chunk of society. So I don't think it's dystopian. I think it's just practically where things are headed. And to some extent have already reached there for a certain population in the United States, as a matter of fact. So AI is just an extension of the exact same thing, maybe faster, maybe more gross in the fact that we have less say in our own future and utility. But the optimist would say, well, yeah, but that frees you up to do whatever you want. You can do anything you want all day long, like whatever. You're no longer constrained by work. I think becoming a Stoic has been very interesting because the story of Sisyphus is supposed to be this terrible one, or it could be the awesome thing of the journey of the work. Like, what does the work give you? The work instills something upon you. It's not just rolling a ball up the hill forever for no reason. That is the reason you're working for a reason. So for me, it is pretty awful. But for a lot of people, I think they're like, hey, if I could just like chillax all day and watch my shows, eating bonbons or whatever, like whatever, if the AI thinks that's what's best for me and I'm happy, I'm happy.
Which that gets into like, obviously we're not going to go there today, but I mean, just like purpose and value of life, right? Yeah.
Well, that was interesting on that